So welcome back, everyone. We are now in week 2 of our 4-week class on Augustinian anthropology and psychology today. By now, we hopefully have been able to watch the videos that Joe Kelly made on kind of giving us a synthesis of all of the different readings that we'll be doing during these 4 weeks. Also, the brief presentation I gave on Augustinian anthropology. We had some readings by Margaret Miles, St. Augustine's Tears, Recollecting and Reconsidering a Life from Augustinian Studies, and also the reading from Gervase Corcoran on Augustine on Prayer. For this week, we have 2 more readings. One is by David Meconi, a Jesuit, Ravishing Ruin. Great title, huh? Self-Loathing in St. Augustine. That was also from Augustinian Studies in 2014, and also a part of a dissertation that I did on rendering an account, an Augustinian spirituality of accountability. So what I'm going to do in this video is give a presentation on some of the main themes of that reading on accountability, especially with regard to what it means to be a minister for the salvation of others. We know that in our own roles as vocation promoters, as initial formation directors, we are called to be accountable in a way, not only for the spiritual growth of our candidates, of those in our formation programs, but also for the salvation of them. And how do we work with them? And we'll be able to unpack this as we go along a little bit further. But let me just give you a little bit of a sense of, for Augustine, what did that mean? Well, where does he get this? How deep is it in his own understanding of who he is as a minister and in his role specifically as priest and then eventually as bishop? So if we look at this was not part of your readings, but I always encourage people to read other things. Letter 21, which Augustine wrote in the year 391. It was very soon after his ordination to the priesthood, when he was kind of taken, he says, I was made to be a priest. Soon after that, he wrote a letter to his bishop. His name was Valerius. And he wrote to Valerius, requesting for time off, not just to relax and go to the beach, but to spend some time studying scriptures. He realized that in order to be the minister that he was being called to be, he needed to know more about what the scriptures say. And specifically, he says in that letter, in paragraph 4, he says, there are so many things lacking that I could more easily list what I have than what I desire to know. He says, for I would dare say that I know and hold with complete faith what pertains to our salvation. And then this is key. But he says, but how am I to exercise this ministry for the salvation of others? Not seeking what is beneficial for me, but for the many, that they may be saved. All right. That's from 1 Corinthians 10:33. But he realizes that that letter to the Corinthians, what takes place before is also important. And what the author is saying is, so whether in chapter 10, verse 31, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. And so that really is the emphasis of letter 21, where we see Augustine at the very beginning of his ordained ministry, recognizing the importance of the scriptures in his life, and not only reading them so that he can have a cerebral, a heady understanding of what the scriptures are, but he wants to bring that into his heart. What does it mean for you? to do everything for the glory of God. Is the role that you have as vocation promoter, role that you have as formation director, does it allow you to do everything for the glory of God? There's another work that's important in Augustine's early period of ministry. It's given the date of around 393. So he was ordained in 391. We don't know the exact year of his ordination as a bishop. Most likely it was 395 or 396. So this work on the Lord's Sermon on the Mount comes right in the middle of his time as a priest. And he tackles a pretty important topic, that topic of the Lord's Sermon on the Mount from Matthew's Gospel. From Matthew 6:1, we hear this: "Take heed, therefore, not to practice your righteousness before men in order to be seen by them." But then he continues on with that 1 Corinthians 10:33. Augustine realizes that that verse from chapter 6 of Matthew's Gospel needs to be connected also to this verse from 1 Corinthians 10:33. "Just as I try to please everyone in every way, not seeking my own benefit, but that of the many, that they may be saved." We know in Augustine's life there was a real connection to St. Paul, to the letters that are attributed to St. Paul. You know, from the letter to the Romans, it was integral in his own conversion. Right? So to this, right? The words from the first letter to the Corinthians, 10:33, "Not seeking my own benefit, but that of the many, that they may be saved." Let's review some real important aspects of Augustine's own understanding of what it means to live in community, what it means to search for the common good together. Because that's what we do, right? When we're introducing candidates to our life, either as vocation promoters or as formation directors, we're introducing them to a style of life that recognizes and values what we hold in common. And so in that Lord's Sermon on the Mount, in Book 2, Augustine says, their Godward advance could be clearly seen by the fact that they were willingly offering what was being asked of them for the sake of a mutual sharing of charity. A mutual sharing of charity. And not for the sake of any pleasure from their gifts. Right? What is being asked of you as a formation director, vocation promoter, right? Must include that sense of what you, in a sense, bring to the table, what you bring to your conversations, what you bring to your ministry, right? Is it for the sake of a mutual sharing of charity? That's what we bring to our own community life. And that's what we're trying to instill upon our candidates. In Sermon 91, Augustine says, "So then, love God's law and don't let all this be a scandal for you." He then goes on in his great rhetorical way, "I beg you, I beseech you, I exhort you all to be meek, to show compassion to those who are suffering, to take care of the weak, and at this time, of many refugees from abroad." How current is that? "To be generous in your hospitality, generous in your good works." And he says, let Christians do what Christ commands. Let's reflect on that during this week, on how the ministry that we're called to do, does it reflect what the gospel calls us? Does it reflect on these words of Augustine? Eventually, let Christians do what Christ commands. Continuing on, and later on in this lecture, we'll get more into Sermon 355, but he says, We live on what we had in common, but what would be our really great and profitable common estate was God. So that mutual sharing, not only of the physical treasures that we have in community life, right? That mutual sharing of love, right? And the charitable works that we do, taking care of the weak, being generously hospitable to those who come from abroad, right? Also, Augustine says, what's our great and profitable common estate is God. And so, from the rule of Augustine, which should be very familiar to all of us, the chief motivation for your sharing your life together is to live harmoniously in the house and to have one heart and one soul seeking God, seeking that common treasure of God. And so, as we work towards helping our candidates towards their own salvation, we're also working towards our own salvation, right? And we need to constantly reflect how our sharing our life together is based on a mutual sharing of charity. Sharing all things in common. From On the Work of Monks, Augustine tells us in chapter 25 of that work, a member of the monastery is one who is no longer seeking what things are of his own, but rather those of Jesus Christ. He has devoted himself to the charity of common life, intending to live in companionship with those who have one heart and one soul in God. Common theme here now, right? So that no one calls anything his own, but all things are held in common. It's from the work of monks. And so we also see from Mark's gospel, though, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And so we realize that when we are sharing all things in common, when we are sharing God, who we have in common, when we are sharing the common works that we do in love, in charity, when we are sharing our own ministry that we present for the community and in the community, we are, in a sense, making real, right, what Mark 12 calls us to: loving God and loving our neighbor. Our ministry as vocation promoters, our ministry as initial formation directors, right, is nothing more really than loving God and loving our neighbor, loving our brother, loving the candidates with whom we're working, those who are growing with us in our Augustinian life. One of the really interesting, I find, and kind of enlightening parts of on the Lord's Sermon on the Mount, which can help us in our own reflection on how we are prepared to become directors of formation and vocation promoters, is to reflect on the Beatitudes and how the Beatitudes, as Augustine puts them, are also reflected and recipients of the fruits of the Spirit. Augustine calls them the operations of the Holy Spirit. And in that, Augustine plays a little bit with the Beatitudes. He kind of puts the first Beatitude and the last Beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. He puts them together, right? And he includes that value of being humble, right, for both of them. And he says that the minister who is humble receives that fruit of the fear of the Lord. The one who is meek receives piety, right? Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Receive piety. The one who mourns, right, they will be comforted. They receive knowledge. To the one who hungers and thirsts for righteousness, fortitude. To the merciful one, counsel. To the pure of heart, understanding. To the peacemaker, wisdom. I think it would benefit all of us if we could reflect on the Beatitudes in our own work, in our own ministry, in our own service, in our own vocation, right? To see how we, in effect, live out the Beatitudes, and do we rely on our own efforts, or do we realize that it's only through the the operation or the fruits of the Spirit that allow us to, in essence, do what we're called to do? Let's get into some of Augustine's sermons and the real meat of this sense of what it means to pay a debt, to be indebted to someone. And I'd like to propose that those with whom we work in our ministries of vocation, promotion, and initial formation, we have a debt to pay to them. From Augustine's narration on Psalm 58. Augustine says, "But since the Lord has willed it so, the time has come to discharge the debt." He's talking about his sermon, right? And then he says to his congregation, "You must be as eager to demand your right as we are assiduous in paying what we owe." Those that are coming into our formation program, those who walk with us in our vocation programs, we have a debt to pay to them. It's not that they owe us anything, right? We owe them something, right? And hopefully they'll be as eager to demand the right to receive that debt as we are eager and assiduous in paying that debt, what we owe. So Augustine obviously was talking about his sermons as debts to be paid, his ministry as a bishop, as a debt to be paid, that service that he gives. On the City of God, I cannot claim to have read all of the City of God. But if you want to read any part of the City of God, and then you can say, I read some of it, read book 19, chapter 19. Okay? It's a really insightful part. In it, he talks about this. And in the active life, it is not honor or power in this life that ought to be prized, since everything under the sun is vanity, he's quoting scripture there. Instead, what ought to be prized is the task accomplished by means of that honor and power. And so do we look at our ministry as a director of formation? You know, we used to use those words, the master of formation. Do we see that task accomplished by means of that honor and power? Just so long as the task is accomplished rightly and helpfully, so that it truly contributes to the well-being of those set under us. The well-being of those set under us, is that for their own salvation? Think about your own sense of who you are as the director of formation, who you are as a vocation promoter. One of the aspects that is a necessary part of our ministry in our common life, not simply those who are formation directors and promoters and vocation, but all of us. We're called to live out the rule that Augustine gives us. And in book 4, part 7, we see the following. Augustine says, "Don't consider yourselves unkind when you point out such faults in fraternal correction. Quite the contrary. You're not without fault yourselves when you permit your brothers to perish because of your silence. Were you to point out their misdeeds, correction would at least be possible. There are times when we are all called to recognize moments in our lives and community when we can and must point out to others, kind of give them a fraternal moment of correction. But then Augustine's work on the Galatians, letter to the Galatians, this is from paragraph 57. He gives us some real important advice. In it, he says, it follows that we should never intervene to correct another's sin without first having examined our own conscience, subjecting it to strict scrutiny, and without having obtained before God the clear answer that this we do motivated by love. In our roles, especially in formation and vocation promotion, we don't always receive the formation necessary to be able to confront somebody in a fraternal way, right? To help them grow, to help them, in a sense, to convert, to help them change behavior, change attitude, change an understanding of who they are. But we cannot do that without first looking at ourselves, without first examining what's going on in our own conscience. And so I really stress that, since we are called to work for the salvation of the other, right? Since we are called to do that, we need to look within ourselves, and we depend upon that master of interiority, right? That inner teacher to help us see what's going on within ourselves so that we can, in a more just and loving way, approach our brothers, approach our students, approach those walking with us in discernment. Mentioned a little bit that piece from Sermon 355. There are actually two sermons that go together. Augustine is a bishop already. The dates are 425 for that sermon 355 and 426 for 356, because it's right after Christmas and then around the time of the Epiphany when he gives these sermons. And what had happened was there was a member of his community, a priest, Januarius, who it was discovered publicly that he left a will. He had children, and he left a will for his children. And this went completely against what Augustine was insisting in his own communities, that they shared everything in common. Now, Augustine wasn't only concerned about the material possessions that we share in common, right? But that sharing in common of the good charitable works that they do, and also God. And he began to see if that sense of holding in one's own possession, personal possession, began to be kind of lessened or exceptions being made. He thought that's going to lead to other things, right? And he needed to approach that quickly, and he did it publicly. This fraternal correction, he didn't follow the exact steps of the rules because it was already a public thing. It was already public knowledge. So Augustine spends this time in the sermons 355 and 356, in a sense, examining his own life in front of his congregation, right? And then promising them that he's going to do what he says that he's going to do, that he's going to fraternally offer correction out of love, motivated by love, to Januarius. Let's look at that sense of responding out of love. And we'll have time when we meet online in the synchronous session to be able to share some of our own experiences. In sermon number 5, we see Augustine saying, "If then God loves and yet reproves, do likewise yourself. If you have anyone under your authority, while you maintain your feeling of love for them, do not deny them the rod of correction. If you do refuse it, you will not be maintaining your love. He dies in his sins, and he might perhaps have given them up if you had corrected him. And what you are really guilty of is hating him. So Augustine uses strong words there, right? He says what we do should always be motivated out of love. Right? That famous sermon from the letter sermon on the first letter of John. Love and do what you will. This is a theme that's kind of consistent throughout Augustine's preaching. Then he offers some reflection for one to personally look at themselves, to see what's going on inside of oneself. He said in Sermon 387, so if you don't love yourself, how can you love your neighbor? The rule for loving your neighbor is taken from yourself. I do love him, you will say to me. That's why I say, first love yourself and utter the reproof to yourself. But if you really and truly utter it out of love, it's obvious that the word which you utter had done something inside you. That word that you utter, right, has done something inside you before you offer that fraternal correction. Going to offer for us something for our own reflection, and that we can spend some time this week jotting notes down, writing something in a journal, perhaps responding on the online blog. Right? This sense of it comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 6. It should be very familiar to us. How can you say to your brother, let me remove that splinter in your eye, when you do not even notice the wooden beam in your own eye? You hypocrite. Remove the wooden beam from your eye first, then you will see clearly to remove the splinter in your brother's eye. So for our reflection, I'm going to ask that you reflect on and then describe a time when you had to offer fraternal correction. What feelings did you have before, during, and after that encounter? We'll be able to share some of our experiences when we meet online. And so we will have a synchronous session, which will be on Friday, October 13th. Please consult the syllabus to find out what time for your region we'll be meeting online. We realized, Dr. Kelly and I realized, that we're all not going to be able to be on at the same time synchronously. So it will be recorded, but we do encourage you, please try as best you can to be online with us. And we'll spend some time sharing as we walk together on this course. So God bless. Thank you for your participation. Let's continue to work together. God bless now.